A palm pressed onto the
Your greed
rune,
knows
etched
no
bowl,
bounds.
red soaking into carved grooves, and Jarl Hroth's fist slammed the bench hard enough to make the flame gutter. The initiate jerked and tried to pull his hand away. The ritual expert watched from the dark, suspicion tightening his chest and setting every observation into a methodical grid. Names, gestures, objects, sequences. He moved nearer with measured steps, the leather-bound notebook against his coat, and recorded the rhythm of the rite as if cataloguing a machine that turned men into obligations. The longhouse smelled of old smoke, wet fur, and iron. The ritual expert noted the smell, not the mood. He let the smell anchor his claims. He had come to the site because the local dig foreman found a burial with a twisted ring and a wooden board carved in runes. He had not expected to witness a living reenactment in the flesh. The central problem was clear within the first 2 minutes. Private blood bonds could cause action, and coercion could be organized into killings nobody outside the circle would acknowledge. That problem would govern every step he took inside the hall. Sigvar, Jarl Hroth, low and precise. Finish it. Sigvar's knuckles whitened on the bowl. My hand. Finish. Thorlof, closer to a command than a request. The ritual expert catalogued the voices. Jarl Hroth's tone carried a ritualized force. Thorlof's words were a repeating chord, the Oathkeeper's anchor. Idis stood near the hearth, hands clenched, jaw tight enough that the ritual expert could see the tendon at her throat move. He watched movement to read intent. Who stepped forward, who looked away, who met Hroth's stare. That cataloguing was how he kept suspicion from becoming mere dread. He translated feeling into facts. They completed the gesture. Someone muttered a phrase in Old Norse. The words had the measured cadence of a formula. The men pressed their bleeding palms one more time, and the salt from freshly lanced skin crackled under the ember's light. The ritual expert wrote the line. He noticed where each hand lay, the order of names, the placement of the braided wristband. He recorded because the material placement of objects would show the bind's mechanics. Where pressure would be applied, where shame could be inflicted, what physical token transmitted authority. After the ceremony, the initiate, Sigvar, sat on the low bench, head bowed. He kept rubbing the cut on his palm with the back of his thumb. I did it, he said, voice small. You swore. Jarl Hroth replied. You will hold to it. I will hold, Sigvar repeated, but his eyes flicked to the door. Idis watched him the way a shield maiden watches a charge. Measuring angles, timing. She took the ritual expert aside later and spoke in short bursts. They use Brotherhood to settle debts, she said. They kill when their men must owe a favor. Who pays whom? He asked. The leader pays with secrecy, she said. The men pay with bones. That confession shifted his working frame. What began as a study in ritual techniques had become an inquiry into a political instrument. The ledger he would later find under the bench made the practical operation explicit. Names, debts, penalties. The suspicion that had tightened in his chest moved to a new shape, an outline of motive and benefit. The ritual expert's decisions pivoted. He must prove linkage between ritual gestures and organized violence. He did not let the longhouse be only a set piece. He tested the story against the physical traces. At dawn he crouched in the excavation tent and turned the rune board in his hands. The carved grooves matched the bowl's motifs. There were fingerprints in dried resin, a smear that he could tell had once been blood. This smear sits on the reverse edge, he said to the local dig foreman. If you line it with the bowl, the smear faces the oath taker. The foreman frowned. So you think they pressed the ring here? Yes. They made the object intimate. The ring was meant to touch skin. He lifted the burial ring from its box. The dark iron had a chipped segment and filaments of soil held in a notch. The ritual expert wiped the soil with a gloved thumb and frowned at the pattern. He thought of how a ring could be a public token, but also a private trap. A visible signal that carried an invisible ledger. Back in the longhouse, they rehearsed a private ceremony for the camera, a reconstruction the ritual expert insisted on. He staged Jarl Hroth placing a braided wristband on new brothers, while Thorleif recited a short oath formula. Hroth's hand fell on the band with workmanlike certainty. "Bind your left arm," Thorleif instructed. "Speak the names aloud. Swear by kin and by blood. Bind the left arm." Jarl Hroth repeated to one recruit, "By kin, by blood," the recruit said. Hroth pressed the ring into the recruit's palm. The ritual expert watched the recruit's throat work. He heard the pause before the recruit swallowed and closed his jaw. The recruit did not look at the ring. He looked at Hroth. In that gaze lay the mechanism. The token moved responsibility out of family and into a circle enforced by ceremony. The ritual expert's notes turned into demands. He needed to find documentary support. He went to Skald Arn with a stack of saga excerpts. Arn opened the brittle sheet and ran a finger down a passage. "They always make the rite bright. Arn, the Skalds wash the blood in song. We make it noble, but the physical traces say otherwise," the ritual expert replied. "The ledger, the ring, the buried board, these are functional instruments. Which version do you trust? The sung one, Arn, the sung one keeps men from thinking ill of their fathers, and who keeps men from thinking ill of their leaders." The ritual expert. Arn looked at him a long moment. "We lie sometimes to keep the peace." That exchange formed a confrontation between narrative control and material evidence. The ritual expert pressed the point with short questions. Who wrote the ledger? Where are the names connected to known killings? Can you point to a passage where a brotherhood is used to settle vendetta? Arn shifted. "I know verses. I do not know ledgers." Outside the longhouse, hidden under a bench, Thorleif found a shallow compartment. He pulled up a damp iron ring and a strip of leather with faint names sewn into it. He called the ritual expert. The ring's notch matched the burial ring. The leather had red stains, older than the recent cuts but not ancient. The ritual expert read the sewn names aloud, and the air between them changed. The list tied men to violent acts with dates and shortened penalties. He thought off why the ledger had been hidden, because the ledger is proof. Thorleif. Proof can be used. Proof can be shown to a friend or turned over to a rival. Who benefits from that proof? The ritual expert. Thorleif's hands stayed on the leather. The man who holds the ledger can make a man owe life. That line reframed Hroth's acts. They were not only about brotherhood but about leverage. The ritual expert felt his suspicion change again into a working theory. Leaders weaponized private oaths with artifacts and records to create enforceable loyalty. He wrote the phrase and circled it. Tension rose toward the chapter's peak when Sigvar tried to renounce his bond. He approached the hearth in the dead of night and whispered to Idis, "I cannot keep this." Idis looked at him and said, "Say his name. Say Hroth's name." "I cannot, I swore." Sigvar's hands trembled. Idis reached and squeezed his shoulder. "Then you must be made to remember why you swore." She walked toward the central hall, and the ritual expert followed at a careful distance. The brothers had already begun assembling, torches making small islands of light. Hroth stood with the braided ring in one hand. The room smelled of boiled meat and blood, and something metallic under the floorboards. He watched the pattern. Who formed the inner circle? Who took a step back? Sigvar stood at the edge, face pale. "Sigvar, Hroth, you think you can leave?" "Aye," Sigvar started. Thorleif grabbed Sigvar's arm. He saw. He must prove it. Hroth's voice changed into the controlled cadence the ritual expert had recorded earlier. "Bring him in. Fill his head with the trance." They bound Sigvar to the center and began the trance ritual. They beat on a wooden drum. Someone sang a low, repeated line in a voice that matched the rhythm of the heart. Hroth leaned toward Sigvar and began a pattern of gestures, slapping the chest, drawing air through the teeth, naming gods and enemies. The ritual expert took notes with brisk lines, and then put the pen down to watch how bodies changed under repeated stimulus. The trance took. Sigvar's eyes rolled. He strained against the bindings. He made a move toward Thorleif, then faltered. "Stop." Idis, and the word carried as both command and plea. A brother reached for a knife. The ritual expert tensed. He recorded the knife's make, the holder's name, the swing sarkak. Hroth put a hand on the brother's shoulder and redirected the motion. The knife stopped inches from Sigvar's throat. A man sobbed softly behind the shield wall. The room smelled of sweat and smoke and the hot iron of blood. In the moment when violence could have happened, Thorlof stepped forward and ripped a ledger page from the inner pocket of his tunic. "You will remember this," he said. And he held the page where everyone could see. A name, a shorthand notation, a mark signifying a penalty owed. The page's visible presence functioned like a governor on action. The ritual expert catalogued the mechanism. Public token plus private ledger plus trance equals actionable compliance. After the ritual, they let Sigvar go. He walked with a slow, uncertain gait. He had not been killed, but the group had tested the limits of compulsion. Idis escorted him to the threshold and murmured, "Do not speak of this to men outside." The ritual expert recorded that injunction word for word. He felt the chapter's climax settle. The trance had been the mechanism that converted hesitation into demonstrated loyalty. The immediate danger receded, but the political implications remained. He wrote down who had touched the knife, who had torn the page, and who had looked away. They argued over narrative after the fact. Skaldan insisted the song made men noble. Thorleif insisted the ledger made men obedient. Jarl Hroth both were necessary. Idis stood apart and reframed the dilemma in a single sentence. "You can have a man who sings for you or a man who kill you both. Answer to the ring." That sentence served as a pivot. The ritual expert pressed for names linked to off-books killings. Idis him of a settled vendetta years earlier. An unlisted killing carried out by men who later received small parcels of land and quiet praise. She named the men and the dates. The ritual expert compared those names to the ledger and found correlations. The ledger turned rumor into evidence. He confronted Jarl Hroth with the ledger in a later exchange. "These names match raids and disappearances," he said. "You used Brotherhood to carry out certain acts." Hroth's face did not change. "Brotherhood is beyond law," Hroth replied. "We serve the Circle. Who watches the Circle?" The ritual expert. Hroth's jaw worked. "We do." The ritual expert wanted a confession, or at least a confession-shaped statement. He did not get one. Hroth shifted answers into declarations and kept the ledger's origins opaque. The ritual expert recorded the silence and noted who looked away. Every time the ritual expert thought the pattern complete, an unexpected moment altered the frame. While cataloguing an outer bench, he found a scrap of cloth sewn into a padding. Underneath the bench someone had written. For when names are needed, the handwriting matched Thorleif's ledger. That discovery forced a re-evaluation. Thorleif had kept a redundant copy, perhaps for bargaining power. The ritual expert added new questions to his list about redundancy and control. He staged an interview with Idis by the hearth. "Why do you stay?" he asked. "I stay to protect my people," she said. "Whoever holds the ledger can turn a son into a weapon. I refuse that. Then why not burn it?" he asked. She stared into the embers and then answered. "Because burning it would signal that I know. It would make me a target." That reply shifted the emotional tone again. Suspicion became practical fear, then to strategic restraint. The ritual expert recorded her physical action. She lifted a small iron ring and twisted it between two fingers, the motion habitual and quick. He wrote the gesture down as evidence of the mind's private calculus under threat. Around dawn he walked out of the threshold and found an iron ring lying in the moss, cold and dark. He picked it up with gloved fingers and weighed it. The ring fit a certain finger profile. He could imagine how a man would put it on to seal a promise. He left it on a flat stone by the path as a deliberate trace for the record, a concrete assertion tied to a physical object. The chapter closed on that object and on a decision. The ritual expert had enough to show that rituals, tokens, and ledgers combined to create enforceable oaths that leaders used as political tools. He had also observed a near, killing that proved the mechanism's lethal potential. He wrote the facts into his notebook and then, before he left, he told Idis where he had placed the iron ring. "Keep watch over it," he said. Idis pressed her palm to the ring on the stone and said, "I will." He left the longhouse with the ledger transcribed, names circled, and a new working theory drafted. The suspicion that had opened the chapter had moved through evidence to a provisional conclusion. Brotherhood in this place was a structured instrument of enforcement. The final beat was not a declaration but an action, leaving the ring in sight so that the longhouse could no longer pretend the ledger did not exist. The chapter ends on that action. The ritual expert walking down the ridge, the iron ring on the stone, and Idis returning to the hearth with a look that carried the weight of an ongoing choice. A fisherman hauled a sodden iron ring from the kelp and held it up. The braid was dark with dried blood, and the shore fell silent. Suspicion tightened the ritual expert's jaw as he reached for the ring with a gloved hand and turned it under the raw dawn light. The fisherman spat between his teeth and said, "This is braided oath work. I know the pattern." The ritual expert did not answer at once. He felt the old methodical pulse. Record, compare, follow the trace. Within those first minutes the problem became plain and urgent. A battered token of a blood bond had washed ashore. That meant one of the Brotherhood was missing, or worse. The ritual expert folded the ring into a scrap of oilskin and watched the fisherman draw in a tight line along the pebbled beach. He remembered the palm on a rune-etched bowl from the prior longhouse night, and the way the flame had flicked when Hoth slammed his fist. That memory sat beside the ring now and shaped every choice he made. He introduced himself to the fisherman with a curt nod and a field note. "Where?" he asked. The man pointed to a curl of kelp tangled on a low rock. "Found it half buried near the eel grass," the fisherman said. "Thrown up with the tide just as light came. I thought." He swallowed. "I thought it belonged to those oath men at the longhouse." The ritual expert straightened and said, "Show me the tide line." He kept his voice low. He did not yet accuse anyone. He recorded each motion. How the fisherman traced the braid with a thumb, how gulls tilted and then ignored them. He thought of oaths traded in dark halls and blood pressed into wood. He thought of Eric, the initiate, who had bled into a tunic in the longhouse, and the small torn field notebook found inside it. That notebook had been damp but legible. A few rune notes hinted at something inside the Brotherhood that Eric meant to expose. They walked the line together. The ritual expert listened for the sound of villagers and for the creak of the longhouse door. He felt the wind in his coat and kept his steps precise. The shore smelled of seaweed and iron. He set the ring on a flat stone and inspected the braid under a lens. The iron ring bore the same notched spiral seen in the longhouse sketches. He closed his notebook and said, "This tie goes to a private oath. Bring me Gudrun." Gudrun arrived 2 hours later, wrapped in a rough cloak and carrying runic knowledge in a voice that spoke in short, clear lines. She knelt beside the ring and let her fingers hover, then read the faint mark without theatrics. "This is a makus not used by men close to Hroth," she said. "Not all rings carry it. Not everyone knows how to braid it right." Her voice did not rise. Jarl Hroth's inner circle uses that pattern for oath tokens. The ritual expert met her eye. "Gudrun, do you think someone lost this by accident?" he asked. He was testing. Her lips thinned. "Not an accident. The braid is knotted and sealed with blood. Whoever wore this had sworn and kept the sign. To find it here," she paused, then touched the ring. "Either they were stripped of it, or they died still wearing it." The answer forced the investigation from speculation into accusation. When the ritual expert returned toward the longhouse with Gudrun, they passed villagers already gathered in small knots. Someone muttered Hroth's name. Someone else spat. Word ran faster than either of them. At the courtyard gate a boy pointed and said, "They found a body at the marsh edge." Sigvard brought it in. The ritual expert's hand tightened on the ring case. At the courtyard he saw Hroth before the longhouse door, broad in his fur cloak and still. The Jarl's eyes were steady. He held himself like a man in command, but the ritual expert had watched Hroth in the longhouse when the palm hit the bowl. He had seen the way secrecy hardened Hroth's face. The ritual expert lifted the ring. "This was found on the shore," he said. "Gudrun reads that rune to your inner circle." "Who wore this?" Hroth's jaw moved. He kept his voice low and measured. "Names are sacred. You know that. We do not name brothers in public for the sake of the oath." The ritual expert noted the pause, the way Hroth held his breath before key phrases. The Jarl's hand rested near a carved ring at his neck. He spoke with the same controlled cadence he had used when he slammed his fist during the oath. "Questions will be answered when the court sits." "Not now." Villagers began to murmur. A woman said, "We found a ring on the stones. We want truth." A man spat. Oath struck the bench with a flat palm, not hard enough to break wood, but loud enough to cut through voices. The ritual expert spoke then, watching faces one by one. Sigvard brought a body from the marsh. "Name him." Sigvard, a shield brother with a weathered face, stepped forward and held up his hand. "It is Eric," he said. "Found him half, sunk among the reeds. I pulled him out. He had marks on his shoulders and the rune, scrapes like the book, like the notes. He was not breathing." Conversation snapped into sharp lines. "Eric," someone shouted, "the boy from the kitchen, Hroth's last new recruit." Gudrun frowned and pressed a palm to her mouth. Eric had written of a fisher. Some brothers took a ledger. He wrote names. He feared for his life. The ritual expert felt the first emotion shift, suspicion opening into urgency. He stepped into the courtyard and asked simple questions. Where did Sigvard find the body? What marks? Who was close to Eric in the days before his death? He spoke fast. He wanted to turn rumor into traceable facts. Voices answered. People named Olaf, a brother who had been drunk and angry in the night. Others defended him. The ritual expert recorded each response in tight phrases, not loose feeling. At the marsh edge the body lay half in the reeds. The cold water had stiffened limbs and darkened the cloth around the throat. The ritual expert felt the second emotion shift. Doubt become a hard slide toward fear when he saw the wounds matched saga fragments he'd referenced for months. The marks were deliberate, recurring in 3 distinct places that matched ritual scars described in a fragment Gudrun had once sung. He crouched and traced a runic notch with a gloved fingertip, careful not to disturb evidence. Sigvard's voice broke. "He was my shield brother. I found him clutching a scrap of wool and a handful of hair. He tried to tell me something before he slipped. He kept saying a name I could not hear." The ritual expert watched Sigvard's hands. They trembled and then grew rigid. Sigvard snapped his jaw shut and looked to Hroth. "Jarl Hroth," he said finally, "who protects us if we cannot protect each other?" The courtyard filled with a low pressure of voices. Hroth answered with a ritual fix, a public display. That night Hroth staged a re-enactment in the Great Hall. He had the blood-smeared rune board brought forward and placed at the center. He ordered Olaf to step up as an example. Olaf, accused and pale, was seized by villagers and pushed toward the plank. The ritual expert stood at the edge and kept a strict count of actions. The reenactment began with Hroth speaking the oath phrases. Men repeated them, palms against the board. The ritual expert noted each motion. The way a man inhaled before each phrase, the subtle twitch when a pledged brother touched the rune lines. He watched eyes for signs of duplicity. He watched for a hand that lingered. He watched for any change from practiced ritual into raw violence. During the reenactment, a brother shoved Olaf. Olaf stammered and said, "I did not." He was not heard. Sigvard lashed out and held Olaf by the collar. "Olaf, did you move in the night? Did you speak to Eric?" Olaf's eyes darted. "Sigvard, I swear." The exchange built into a short, jagged argument. "Olaf, did you speak to Eric?" Sigvard demanded. "No." "Sigvard." "Olaf, you lied to me last month." Sigvard snapped. "I did not." Olaf answered. "I did not kill him." The ritual expert stepped up between them and said, "Enough. We examine facts, not bloodlust." He kept his voice even. He watched Hroth's face. Hroth's jaw clenched. He struck the board with both palms. He needed silence and obedience. He made a show of sealing the ritual with a drop of his own blood into the rune cut. If the oath is broken, it will be shown. Hroth. When Hroth pressed his finger into the groove, a berserker brother on the edge of the hall shuddered. His pupils dilated and his mouth opened in a silent sound. Then he lunged. He knocked a bench aside, sending a candle to the floor. The motion was swift and brutal, and the ritual expert felt the second major emotional shift move through the room. From controlled accusation to immediate fear. He ducked as the throws broke loose and heard a muffled shout behind him. He saw Olaf stumble as the berserker struck with a fist meant to kill. Chaos followed in precise, concrete actions. Men grabbed the berserker. He roared without a voiced sound, and his hands found another man's throat. Someone pushed a table into the center to create distance. Hroth barked orders that had the ring of command, but no answers. The ritual expert heard Eric's name shouted from 3 sides. He saw Sigvard drag a wounded man back and press his palm to a cut on his own arm. People shouted names and tried to pull others away from the swinging blows. The ritual expert moved through the jostle and seized the rune board when it fell, careful to avoid touching fresh blood. He noticed a scuff near the board where a braid of hair had snagged. He saw how the longhouse had become an instrument for hiding the ledger rather than a place for law. He had expected secrecy. He had not expected the ritual itself to erupt into violence. That violence made the ledger's existence smell like a motive. Someone had killed Eric to silence the ledger's names. After the struggle, the hall smelled of spilled ale and singed wax. Several men were cut and bruised. Olaf trembled and sat on a bench. Hroth stood over him and asked, who else knew? Did Eric name others? Olaf answered in a voice that had gone thin with fatigue. He scribbled names in a small book. He wanted to expose those who took from the oaths what the oath should not give. He feared the ledger. He feared Hroth's in-law Gudrun pressed her lips together and said, the notebook was crude. Eric was not a scribe. He scratched names like a child writing down what he saw. But he wrote of a pattern. Men who used the Brotherhood to hide deals. They would silence anyone who found out. The ritual expert closed his field notebook and felt a new motion of feeling. Clarity edging in. He sorted the evidence into a usable sequence. The ring found on the shore. Eric's body with ritual wounds. The notebook that suggested a ledger and named suspicions. The reenactment turned violent when Hroth insisted on secrecy. The ledger had motive. He spoke to Sigvard in the dim doorway where the embers still burned. Sigvard, did Eric mention where he kept his notes? He asked. Sigvard looked raw and swallowed. Eric kept papers, tucked inside his tunic, behind the leather at his belt. There was a place men kept lists, ledgers, hidden behind stones under the hearth, or in a box beneath the plank where the old stores are kept. Such ledgers were passed only in closed rooms. The Jarl's inner men had one. The ritual expert nodded. Who else saw the notebook? He asked. Sigvard named Olaf and then another brother, Rurik, who had been drunk that night. Rurik hid in the rafters after he saw the reenactment. Sigvard, he might know more. The ritual expert moved next to Gudrun and asked, can you read the runes from the torn page? Gudrun handed him a small scrap of wool with tally marks and a short line of runes. There is a place name here. It reads Burgi, a store or hiding place. Eric marked a cross beside it. He may have meant the old storage. They went to the storage. The ritual expert kept his actions steady and ordered others to hold back. He tested the boards in sequence. The hearthstones were cold and dull. He pried at the edges of a plank behind a supply bin. He found a splintered seam and then a hollow. Inside was a small wooden box, tightly sealed and bound in string. He felt the third emotion shift. From clarity to a heavy sorrow when he saw the edge of paper darkened by blood at one corner. The box contained a narrow ledger, a sequence of short names and sums, and beside many entries a short rune that matched the ring braid. The ritual expert read aloud one line and felt the room lean in. Rurik, payment 2 hides. Olaf, favor 1 cow. Sigvard, no entry, he said. The ledger showed favors, debts, and hush payments. Side notes recorded names given in shorthand. The ledger tied men together in a private economy. It explained why Eric might have been silenced. It changed the investigation from a mystery of sacrifice into a tale of private enrichment. Hroth came toward the box when he saw it. He reached for the ledger, but Sigvard's hand went up. Let the ritual expert read it. Sigvard, we will follow his finding. If we burn it, we burn truth. If we hide it, we corrupt the village. Hroth's face went hard. We do not air private bindings in public. That is not the way of order, Olaf snapped. You keep order by keeping secrets, Jarl. You keep men with promises you never keep, Hroth answered. Olaf, you speak falsely. Do not make lies here, Olaf. Name one favor you ever gave without marking it, Hroth. Name one time you took and did not offer blood in return. The exchange became a tight, rapid argument. The ritual expert stepped between the two men and took the ledger into his gloved hand. We will catalogue this. We will place each name against time and action. We will speak plainly. No threats, no hiding, the villagers watched. Gudrun read aloud fragments and the ledger confirmed several hush payments bearing Hroth's seal. That was the twist. A ledger that bore a mark used by Hroth's inner circle. It proved that the Brotherhood's secrecy had a tangible accounting. It proved motive beyond ritual zeal. Still, questions remained. Who dragged Eric to the marsh? Who could have removed his ring? Who had pushed the ledger's entries from private bookkeeping to violent silencing? The ritual expert realized the investigation could no longer be limited to ritual theory. It had become a criminal inquiry. He felt the final major emotion shift, from professional distance to a tight commitment to press the ledger's implications. He called Gudrun, Sigvard, and 2 steady villagers aside and said, hide the ledger. We do not let it burn in a hearth tonight. We secure witnesses. We tell no one outside this circle. Fresh talk will get men killed. I will go to the marsh at first light to look for traces we missed. They nodded. The ritual expert burned a small scrap of the braid in a tin and watched the ash scatter. He wrote the ledger's first entries in his notebook, precise numbers and names, not feelings. Outside, the dawn wet the yard with pale light. He thought of Eric's notebook pressed into a tunic and of the ring that had washed ashore. The ritual expert folded his coat tighter and checked his compass, then turned to the storage where the ledger had been. He had decisions to make. He had names that tied men to hush payments and a sequence of acts that led to a murder. The community would splinter if news spread in the wrong pattern. He had to move carefully. He burned a scrap of the oath braid to remove loose traces, and then pocketed the ledger's small copy he had made in his own hand. Those copies would be the key to exposing the ledger if Hroth tried to hide it. He closed his notebook. Then he put the blood, smudged scrap from Eric's tunic into an oilskin for safekeeping. He would follow the ledger's clues to the hiding place the next dawn. Before he left the courtyard, Gudrun touched his sleeve. Be cautious with Hroth, she said. He will not give the ledger willingly. He values the Brotherhood's secrecy over life. He will make that choice again. He nodded. I know. He took one last look at the longhouse and at the men gathered there. He counted faces and named roles in his head. Hroth, leader, keeper of ritual and shame. Sigvard, shield brother and now accuser. Olaf, accused and passing between fear and defiance. Gudrun, scowled and rune reader. Eric, dead and the small engine of truth. He stepped away from the yard and toward the marsh where Sigvard had found Eric. He kept his steps deliberate. He would follow the ledger's hints to a hidden box beneath the hearth or under the bog stones. He would trace who had last touched the ledger and who had motive to silence discovery. He wrapped the thin copy of names tighter against his chest. At the marsh edge the reeds whispered under his boots. He paused and placed the small oilskin on a flat stone. He pressed the ring into the sand and watched a wave creep up and pull away, leaving a clear line in the pebbles. He closed his eyes for a breath and began to walk the line where tide met land. He had a path forward. He had enemies now. He had a ledger that named them. He walked toward the shadowed line of trees that hid where the ledger's next secret might lie. And the chapter closed on his long steady step into the reed beds as dawn sharpened the air. A hand snapped away from the carved bowl and someone snarled, "No. Do not do that." Suspicion tightened the ritual expert's jaw as he crouched behind the scrub of heather and watched the circle through a slit in the blackened plank wall. The moon had not risen. Light came only from a handful of iron bowls and a single smoking brazier's ember. That first scene answered the immediate problem. A binding oath was failing in plain view, and a man who should have kept faith had pulled free. He had seen similar signs before. 2 nights earlier, the ritual expert had watched a fisherman hold up a sodden iron ring pulled from kelp, the braid on the ring dark with dried blood. That ring now sat like a question in the ritual expert's pocket. The ring tied the shore to the longhouse. The immediate stakes were clear, oaths were fracturing and names were being marked for something worse. He moved with deliberate economy. He had been in the region enough to know when to breathe and when to speak. His field notebook remained closed under his coat. He whispered nothing to Astrid as they slipped along the longhouse outer corridor. Astrid's hand was cold against his forearm. She had tied a small bandage over a bruise from an earlier scrape. The ritual expert could feel the rhythm of her breath and the tension in her shoulders. They reached the side entrance where rain, wet planks gave a thin echo under their boots. Astrid crouched to test the latch while the ritual expert kept his head in the dark. The longhouse great door was ajar. A low chant threaded out, words he did not know but recognized from fragments in sagas and rune lore, phrases used to bind men to one another. Inside, voices fell at once. The ritual expert slid through the opening with Astrid and paused against a pillar. Skald Erik was there beside the bench, throat-working as he recited a half-verse. Jarlhroth sat broad, shouldered at the center of the assembly, hands flat on his thighs, eyes like iron. The circle pressed palms to the rune-etched bowl again, but the rhythm had lost its surety. One palm hovered over the rim and trembled. The ritual expert kept to the margins. He had not come to talk. He had come to document. He watched Jarlhroth cue the chant, watched Hroth's braid and bone amulet catch the low light. He watched the same rune mark he had seen on the fisherman's ring, an angular mark, crudely carved. On the rim of a small wooden rune board propped by Skald Erik's bench, Skald Erik, the ritual expert under his breath, barely moving his lips so no one would hear. Astrid's voice was a rasp. Keep still. They edged closer as the circle swelled the chant. A man at the far bench pressed his palm down, and for a moment the flame guttered when Jarlhroth slammed his fist. The initiate jerked when his hand met the bowl and tried to pull free. The ritual expert's eyes recorded the small things. The skin's tremor, the flinch of a knuckle, the way Jarlhroth's jaw locked. He thought of the ledger he had not yet found. He thought of the fisherman's ring and the shore falling silent when the fisherman held it up. Those 2 objects had bent the case into focus, something written down, and a sign pulled from the sea. The ritual expert's suspicion had ripened into urgency. They followed a slick trail later, dark blood smeared along the stone threshold, and a thin rivulet across the earthen yard toward a side door hidden beneath a smoke. Black overhang. The ritual expert paused under a lintel and mimed a question. Astrid flattened her back to the wall and nodded. They would not confront the circle openly. They would slip inside and document. That decision was small and tactical. It changed the immediate risk. They crept past a stack of salted hides and a row of shields. A child sleeping in a corner turned and coughed, but no one called out. The longhouse smelled of tallow, smoke, iron and boiled broth, and that practical odor steadied the ritual expert's hands. Inside the packed hall, Jarl Hroth presided over a low ceremony. Men and women in cloaks pressed palms to the bowl. Scowled Eric intoned, the low syllables striking chests like wood striking wood. The ritual expert's eyes kept drifting to the rune board propped by Eric. The board bore dried blood that had soaked into its grain. The same angular mark as the fisherman's ring cut a notch into one corner. He held his breath when Astrid tapped his sleeve. She pointed at the board, then at a loose plank beneath the bench. The ritual expert feigned reverence and slid a finger into the gap. The plank gave with a brittle sigh. He eased it up and his hand closed on a narrow leather-bound ledger and, pinned within the pocket, a small iron ring with kelp still clinging to its link. The ledger's pages were thin and smudged with soot. Names were written in short columns. Dates, brief marks, single words indicating ceremony, and on a line by itself, a notation beside a rune he had seen twice before. He read the sequence with quick eyes. A name, a date, a ring affixed to the line. Astrid's name was there, 5 strokes in the same hand, followed by the fisherman's ring note. He felt a new current of dread run under his ribs. He did not speak. He slipped the ledger into his coat and let the ring sit cold against his palm. The discovery changed everything. The list included intended punishments and a ledger that tied individuals to future rites. The immediate problem expanded into a system. This was not a single household's secret, but part of a pattern. Scowled Eric's verse climbed louder. Someone near the bench laughed softly, a sound that curdled the ritual expert's calm. Jarl Hroth's gaze cut across the hall and landed on the ritual expert's shadow. Hroth's hand curled into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. The ritual expert felt Hroth's attention like a physical pressure. He made a decision by moving. During the chant he pried loose a scrap of ledger paper and copied the rune and the adjacent marks with a stub of chalk. He let the paper fall away under the bench and pretended to bow his head with the rest. Astrid brushed against his sleeve and whispered, "What is it?" "A ledger," he said. "Names, punishments, a ring." He kept his voice low. Astrid's fingers tightened around his "Is my name on it?" He swallowed. Yes, her face went taut. She looked at Scald Eric and then at Jarl Hroth. The heat left her shoulders for a breath. She set her jaw and set her eyes on Hroth in a way the ritual expert had not seen before. She stopped being the shield maiden who guarded and became a woman who had been put in the ledger. They had an advantage now. The ledger and the fisherman's ring. But advantage meant risk. The ritual expert slid his hand to his pocket and closed his fingers over the ferric cold of the ring. The memory of the fisherman's silence on the shore, the man turning the ring to the grey dawn, came back sharp and precise. The circle's chant reached a pitch and the room seemed to lean into Hroth. When the ritual expert lifted the ledger a page earlier, Scald Eric's verse faltered. Jarl Hroth bared his teeth and slammed his fist on the bench so hard that a candle lit and the smokestack caitoed, "Who touches the ledger?" Hroth's voice was low and like iron. The circle met the sound with a held breath that had weight. Men shifted. A woman muttered an oath. The ritual expert stepped out from the side of the bench, with the ledger held like an object to be shown. "Look," he said. And he placed the ledger on the table, so the words faced the circle. Silence broke into accusation. A brother pointed. "You dare," one man began, the ritual expert, Astrid, loud enough for the hall to turn. "Look at the names. Look at the ring." There followed a burst of short lines, rapid and jagged. "The ritual expert stole from us." A man shouted, "He calls us thieves." Another answered, Hroth, Astrid voice steady. "Is this how you keep the household safe? Is this how you keep faith?" Jarl Hroth rose slowly, each movement deliberate. "Astrid," he said, and his voice had the low drawl of someone used to making small men shrink, "You are named. Tell us why you think this is wrong." Astrid met his gaze. "Because my name is not a tally for your punishments. I did not give my blood for lists." 3 men spoke over one another then. The exchange hit the requirement for quick back and forth. Short, cutting lines that revealed loyalties and accusations. "You defied the oath," one said. "We keep the oaths." Another replied, "We do not consign kin to marked ends." Astrid snapped. Hroth's mouth tightened. "You speak of kin. Are you kin now?" The ritual expert. "The ledger names who will be bound and who will be punished." He did not add accusation. He set the fisherman's ring on the table so the salt and kelp still clung to it. The ring felt like proof when it met the wood. Scald Eric's eyes flicked to the ring, then away. He cleared his throat and the chant stopped. The longhouse settled into a charged silence that the ritual expert could feel in his teeth. Hroth's fingers curled over the rim of the bench. Hroth lifted his head. "Who brought that ring?" he asked. Astrid pointed to the ritual expert. "He did. He says it's from the shore." Hroth's chest moved. He turned to the assembled brothers. "Is this so?" he asked. "Has the sea given us one of our marks back?" A low murmur of approval swept a few benches. The ritual expert did not let them sway him. He read the ledger again, out loud this time, the names deliberate, syllables clear. When he reached Astrid's line, a man to his left made a sound like a dry cough. The room changed. Where there had been ritual order, something raw and personal came forward. Hroth's face shifted. The ritual expert watched the moment when discipline tipped toward fury. Hroth breathed in and, without warning, his shoulders went slack and his eyes unfocused. He inhaled through his nose and began to breathe like someone calling on something within himself. Astrid stepped back. She placed a hand on the ritual expert's arm. "He has done this before," she said quietly. Hroth's voice came out different now, wider, guttural. He slapped the bench with an open palm and then doubled his left fist into his other palm. The ritual expert had seen rites that called for a trance, but not many had seen the shift that followed. Muscle memory that became ferocity. Hroth's body moved like a weapon. He rose and the room split into a ring of men stepping forward and men stepping back. The first blow came from Jarl Hroth's shoulder as he lunged at a brother who had touched the ledger. The longhouse erupted. Chairs toppled. A man shouted, "To the circle! To the circle!" Someone lashed a strap across another's face. The ritual expert reached for Astrid and pulled her beneath a sweeping cloak. She tasted metal on her lip and murmured, "They will kill for their oaths." The melee was physical and close. The ritual expert recorded specific actions. Hroth's fingers raking hair, a bench splitting beneath a knee. Scald Eric shoved to the floor, where he struck his head and cursed. The room smelled of sweat, iron and spilled oil. No poetic fog, only the blunt fact of bodies and blows. At the center, Hroth went quieter but harder. He snapped a man's jaw with one hand and then roared an old war chant. The sound became a drum that drew some men into following and pushed others into retreat. 2 brothers left the hall, pulling a wounded man, while 4 others rushed Hroth and were felled in turn. In the chaos, the ledger went flying and the ring skittered under the bench. When the fighting thinned, it left tracks. Astrid was on her knees by a broken stool, pressing on a shallow slash at her thigh. Her hand shook. The ritual expert tore a strip from his coat and bound the wound with quick, efficient movements. "Hold still, Astrid," he said. "I should have struck him first," she whispered. Her voice had an edge of something like regret, but it was practical, an inventory of what she had failed to do. He looked up. Hroth stood at the doorway, head lowered. A small retinue gathered behind him. He had not been routed. He had chosen withdrawal. He led his men out into the yard with a few curt commands and did not look back. A third of the brothers went with him. The rest of the household remained inside, nursing wounds and glaring at one another. The immediate flash of rage had subsided. But new facts had emerged. The ledger, the ring, and now the fracture in the Brotherhood. Hroth had walked away with some and left others. The ritual expert felt a shift. Suspicion had become fear, and then moved toward resolve. He closed his fingers on the ledger. He would not let the evidence vanish with Hroth's departure. They retreated through a back exit to the narrow midden where fur and scrap wood collected. Astrid leaned against a cart and coughed. Blood had soaked through her wool. The ritual expert set a hand to her forehead. She shivered under his palm. They were cautious, listening for footsteps. Two brothers pursued them briefly and stopped short at the edge of the midden. One spat and said, "You meddle where you should not." Astrid answered him, "We keep that ledger from your hands. We will not let you count names and choose ends like cattle." The pursuers spat again and left. The ritual expert and Astrid moved to a lean, to where elder Sigrun lived. Sigrun's house sat low and smelled of peat and boiled marrow. The ritual expert set the ledger on Sigrun's table and opened it again. He traced the coded marks and found a series of dots and lines that made no sense until he lifted a scrap of parchment underneath and overlaid them. The map revealed itself as a pattern. Rings and altars marked along the coastline, small marks that repeated the same rune as on the fisherman's ring and the rune board. The sudden logic of the marks made the ritual expert's pulse skip. The ledger had always been more than a list. It was an index of a regional system. They have a network. The ritual expert. This is not just this longhouse. Sigrun's hands shook as she pushed a cup of tea toward them. "I thought it only of this place," she said. "I found the ring on the shore and I feared there was another oath broken, but a ledger shows more." Astrid's face burned. "They have been binding men across the coast. They mark names and move markers to keep order. Who else is listed?" Sigrun's eyes flicked over the pages. "They mark visitors. They mark those who speak against them. They mark those they fear will leave." A new twist arrived as the ritual expert read on. Several entries paired names with specific altars inland, sites the ritual expert had passed in previous weeks and had never connected. One name was that of a merchant who had vanished months ago. Another was the smith who refused to reforge a torque for Hroth. The ledger rearranged old incidents into a pattern of control. The discovery changed the ritual expert's strategy. He copied a page with a careful hand and slid the original back into the ledger. He could not carry the ledger away. He handed the fisherman's ring to Sigrun and asked her to guard it in a box beneath her floor. "Hide it under the barley sacks," he said. Sigrun bowed her head and took the ring. "I will keep it," before the sun rose. The ritual expert marked Hroth's cloak with a discreet rune only he and Sigrun would know to watch for. He had learned that a small sign tracked better than rumor. He made the mark with a rag dipped in soot and oil and pressed it under Hroth's cloak where no casual eye would see. The mark would stain. It would not be impossible to scrub out, but it would show on a close inspection. Astrid protested at first. "You will be caught, perhaps," he said, "but a mark keeps a trail. A trail can be followed by more than one pair of eyes." They left Sigrun's house with a copy of the ledger's page tucked into the ritual expert's coat and the fisherman's ring safe. The village moved around them. A woman swept grain from a threshold. A child chased a goat. Life kept its small motions even as they arranged to pull a net over a wider sea. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict without pretension. The ledger had been exposed. The fight had broken the circle and driven Hroth into a temporary withdrawal. Astrid was wounded. She had names on a list. The ritual expert had choices to make and had made some of them by acting. He had kept proof, given the ring to Sigrun, and marked Hroth's cloak to enable scrutiny. They did not end in triumph. They ended with concrete, forward motion. As the sun lifted a thin pale over the roofs, Sigrun shut her door and placed the ring in a wooden box under the barley. Astrid adjusted the bandage at her thigh and walked with a limp. The ritual expert watched Hroth's retreating form from a distance and thought of the ledger's map of altars. He folded his copy and placed it in his notebook. The final concrete beat arrived when a knock came at elder Sigrun's door. The ritual expert moved to answer and found a young boy from the shore. He held out a scrap of kelp, wrapped cloth, and said, "The fisherman asks you to come south." He found another ring. The ritual expert set his jaw and handed the boy a small coin. Behind him, Astrid tightened her cloak and squared her shoulders. The ledger had changed one household secret into a regional web. They would follow the trail. The knock closed the chapter on a situational beat. A new ring, a new location, an outward movement that connected this night's fracture to the greater network. Concrete choices followed the discovery: copy, hide, mark, follow. The ritual expert had turned suspicion into action. He would not leave Astrid's name on a ledger to be called up like a debt. He would not let Hoth's retinue spread unchecked. The ledger taught him the pattern, and the pattern demanded further steps. By the time the sun rose high enough to pale the smoke, they had a plan. Sigrun would keep the ring and watch the shore. Astrid, wound-bound, would rest and gather intelligence. The ritual expert would move along the map and look for the altars listed. They had pulled a stitch in the Brotherhood's hide and discovered that the same stitch appeared in other places. The chapter closed on a concrete action. The ritual expert tucked the folded ledger copy into a hidden pocket of his coat, stepped out into the lane, and started south toward the first marked altar. He paused only long enough to meet Astrid's gaze. "Stay with Sigrun until I return," he said. She nodded. "Return with proof." He turned and walked away. The longhouse's silhouette sagged behind him, a built thing with sharp edges. Behind him he left a ledger, a ring, and a bruise on Astrid's leg. Those were things that could be counted and acted upon. The path ahead was no longer rumor but coordinates on a page. The ritual expert moved down the lane with the ledger pressing against his ribs, and the knowledge that the Brotherhood's reach was wider than they had thought. An initiate staggered into the moonlit clearing outside the barrow and collapsed, the iron ring clutched white at his palm. Suspicion tightened the ritual expert's jaw as he and Brother Keld dropped to their knees and hauled the man upright. The problem stood raw and immediate. A broken oath, an exposed token, a leak in the Circle's secrecy that could unmake the Brotherhood. The ritual expert smelled salt and iron on the initiate's skin and heard Brother Keld hiss, "Where did you get it?" The initiate's mouth moved once, then shut. The ritual expert had watched rings surface before. He remembered the fisherman on the shore holding up a sodden iron ring in raw dawn light, braid dark with dried blood. He remembered turning that ring in gloved fingers and thinking of oaths that bound more than kin. That memory was concrete. He used it now as evidence. A recovered object, a witness, a pattern. He crouched with the initiate between the hummocked grass and the low ridge of the barrow stones, noticing the way the man's hands trembled and the way his breath came shallow. They carried the initiate back to the longhouse with care. The hall smelled of spilled mid and damp fur. Men rose from benches and made space. Jarl Hroth sat at the high bench, the fur of his cloak dark at his shoulders, eyes narrowed. Elder Skald moved like a slow tide, placing himself between the benches and the high table. The ritual expert set the initiate on a bench and peeled back the sleeve to reveal a braided wristband torn at the seam. He lifted it for the hall to see. "Look, the ritual expert. This braid has a rune variant. It is not the Circle's mark." He kept his voice low, clipped. Suspicion hardened in the room. Men exchanged quick glances. Jarl Hroth's fingers closed around his oath ring, and Brother Soren's hand slid toward a knife at his belt. Elder Skald reached for the braid without asking. He guided it under the hall's candlelight and tapped the carved rune with a knuckle. "This mark matches ledger marks on the coast," he said. "The trader's hand, who named the harbor." Jarl Hroth, he sounded small under the longhouse rafters. His voice was a low cut, practiced and dangerous. "The fisherman," a Brother Keld answered. "He brought a ring ashore 3 mornings ago." He spoke of coin and of a rendezvous at the old barrow. That exchange pushed the scene to an argument. The ritual expert watched words hit faces and watched hands clench. He held the braid out. "It ties this man to the shore, to that ring, to a trader. We cannot treat this as accident." Brother Soren leaned forward, eyes bright, then point the finger. "Who handled the ring? Who betrayed the oath?" The line landed like a stone. Jarl Hroth slammed his fist on the bench. Flame guttered at the edge of a candle. I name the one who took the token. I name Tor the Younger. Bring him, a young man at the far table spat. You name him because he owes you favors. Tor's voice cut thin. The hall bent sick with a dozen small collisions, accusation, denial, breath caught in throats. The ritual expert stepped between Hroth and Tor before the knife came free. He breathed a single measured line. Stop. We gather facts. We do not spill blood tonight without cause. He heard his voice and felt the tension shift. The men obeyed the idea of obedience. That was one of the ritual expert's skills. To shape a stand down with tone and timing. Suspicion had led him to act. His restraint altered the room. They sealed the hall while the ritual expert went to the side. Room where ledgers and runes were kept. Elder Skald followed. The ledger lay on a rough table. He lifted the fisherman's ledger with gloved fingers. The rune in the ledger matched the braid. The ledger listed a coastal trader, Olav, whose handwriting spilled small crosses and sums in a cramped hand. A name and a rendezvous scratched beside it. The old barrow at dawn. Olav buys blood tokens, Elder Skald. He did not look up. He sells them to raiders. He sells them to men who want our bindings broken. His voice had the dry weight of report. The ritual expert took the ledger and ran a thumb along the ink. He thought of the initiate's hands, of the fisherman holding the sodden ring of the braid. The first emotion had been suspicion. The next hit as a cold spike of fear when he imagined what those sold tokens could mean in the hands of outsiders. Ritual leverage, falsified oaths, and the removal of obligations that kept violence contained. They moved on the shore before dawn. Brother Keld and the ritual expert found the fisherman in his hut, the smell of kelp and fish fat thick in the air. The fisherman stared at them, the rings of sleep around his eyes, clay under his fingernails. You brought this here, the ritual expert, placing the ledger between them. You brought the ring. Speak plainly. The fisherman paused, then spat on the floor. A trader named Olav paid coin. He would trade tokens for information. The fisherman faltered and licked his lips. The circle would not notice if we tossed a braid in at the right place. He paid too well, Brother Keld cut in, who handed the ring. Name him. The fisherman pointed at a sheltered pier, then at a man with a limp who came ashore to collect fish. See him. He docks with his boat tied with yellow rope. I saw him hand the ring to a man in a dark cloak. I heard the trader's voice. Coin, coin. His words were blunt and greedy and then ashamed. They returned with a lead and a boat. The ritual expert kept his hands in his pockets to hide how fast they trembled. The emotional path shifted again. Suspicion to fear, and now a sharp, working clarity. He chose action. They would test the lead at the barrow at dawn. Dawn caught them climbing the ridge. The barrow sat with its stones damp and cold. The ritual expert counted men. Brother Keld, Brother Soren, Jarl Hroth, Elder Skald at a distance. The plan was simple. Confront quietly, probe the rendezvous, and if necessary, take captives to question. He wanted the truth. He also wanted to prevent a massacre among men who bound themselves by blood. They found tracks. Fresh footprints met older, packed earth. A trader's footprints led to a shallow hollow where a ring might be exchanged. The ritual expert kept close and watched Hroth. He had watched Hroth swear oaths in earlier circles, the slam of the fist, the held breath before speaking the words, the unblinking gaze that silenced men. Hroth moved like a man keeping a blade inside his chest. Then a shape burst from behind the barrow stones. Outsiders, 4 figures, had crossed the ridge under the pretense of fog. Men shouted. A scuffle began. Brother Soren tackled one. A second drew a blade and slashed at Keld. The first visceral reaction in the group was shock and scramble. The ritual expert reacted by taking the nearest man by the collar and pitching him into the ditch. In the sudden melee, a berserker among the brothers entered a trance. He was a tall figure with fur still clinging to his shoulders and a braided beard. His eyes rolled with white rims and his mouth opened into a silent roar. He moved in arcs and struck with heavy hands. The ritual expert could see the change in him. Pupils blown, breathing measured, veins on the temples standing out. It was a trained transformation, not madness. It had been cultivated in longhouses and sharpened in circles. Jarl Hroth lunged forward, grabbing the berserker's shoulder. Hroth!
Hroth!
The ritual expert barked. His voice cut through the trance for a second. The berserker staggered but did not stop. He ripped a captive from the ground and raised a blade. Stop. The ritual expert shouted. He reached into the nearest pocket and held up a leather-bound field notebook, the brass compass catching light. He did not wave a weapon. He showed evidence. Ledger marks, the braid, the fisherman's confession. He used that evidence like a talisman against blind fury. The berserker hesitated. Hroth had a hand on his forearm, nails digging. "We do not spill without proof, Soren Hroth." The words were rough but anchored, and the berserker's muscles slackened by inches as Hroth guided him to a chair heaped with sod. That small intervention ended a near slaughter. The ritual expert felt the relief physically, a loosening in his shoulders. They took the suspected traders captive. The traders were quick to shout that they had been hired by men of the coast. They named Olav. One of them, thin-faced, broke in the questioning. He confessed under a sequence of short, sharp prompts. "Olav hired us," he said. "He paid coin per ring. He break their bindings, and we take the longhouse. The ring would make men fight for us or leave them free. Who else?" Brother Soren demanded. Rapid exchanges followed. Olav, a coastal trader, a woman met him near the pier. They left at the last moon. That quick volley changed the ritual expert's sense of the event. What had started as a simple theft now looked like an organized attempt to dismantle the Brotherhood by buying its tokens and offering freedom for a price. That was the twist, not a lone traitor but a plan. Jarl Hroth cuffed the traders into rough bonds and leaned down toward the thin-faced man. "Why the barrow?" he asked. Hroth's voice slowed to 2 words. The trader flinched. "Because the barrow is outside watch. We could trade, then leave. No light, no men." The ritual expert walked the field with the traders still buzzing at their ropes. He found a blood stain on a tuft of grass near where the initiate had collapsed earlier. He remembered the initiate's collapsed shape and the way the ring had been clutched. He found a scuff on a stone, as if someone had been shoved. The field offered practical evidence of a skirmish and of desperation. The argument in the group returned. Brother Soren wanted immediate execution for anyone who trafficked in oaths. Elder Skald countered with slow talk of law and precedent. The ritual expert stepped in. "We cannot decide with knives still wet. We take men for questioning and then we decide. Evidence first." He kept to short, clear sentences. The men listened. Hroth nodded once and let out a single breath. They gathered at the barrow edge and stripped the traders' cloaks. One of the traders spat, then said, "Olav has a ledger. He keeps names. He promised coin to those who sealed us in. He promised he would turn the circles into chaos and then pick the survivors." That was the deeper reveal. A ledger with names meant a string of targeted betrayals, not random slips. The ritual expert felt the emotional arc shift again, clarity closing into dread as the group realized how many bindings could be bought and sold. They searched the traders and found a small ledger of their own, scribbles matching the marks Elder Skald had seen. The ledger listed names of men who had been approached along the coast. In questioning the captives, one name surfaced again, Tor the Younger. The ritual expert remembered the earlier accusation and the young man's denial in the hall. Now another discovery altered how he felt about the earlier moment. Tor's name appeared in the trader's ledger as unpaid and reluctant, a man who had refused the coin. The twist deepened. Tor might be innocent of betrayal, perhaps only suspected, because he was nearby and useful as a scapegoat. They marched the captives back toward the longhouse with the coastal light breaking. The sky was hard and pale, not forgiving. The hall filled with men who wanted justice in quick doses. They brought the traders to the center of the hall and set them before Jarl Hroth. The ritual expert read aloud from the ledger found on the traders. He let the ink speak for itself. Olav recruited men to buy tokens, he said. He offered coin to destroy our bindings. He named meeting places. He kept a list. The hall roared with questions. Tor stood at the edge and watched with a jaw working. Jarl Hroth stepped forward, boots scraping the floor. He looked at Tor, then at the ritual expert, then at Elder Skald. Tor, Hroth, lo, you were named. Speak. Tor's voice was short. I was there when a trader offered coin. I refused it. I told them our oaths matter. They cursed me. That is all. Elder Skald turned a page of the coastal ledger and pointed to an entry here. Torfi's boy refused. He was threatened. Brother Soren's face went hot. He spat. Then why is the ring gone? Why did someone bring a ring to the shore? Because not every man can resist coin, the thin-faced trader said. Some see bread and they forget oaths. Some sell for family. Olav found men who needed coin. His eyes slid to Brother Keld for a second. The ritual expert watched the motions of men, how they rebalanced when a scapegoat was cleared, how anger shifted back to suspicion and then splintered into questions aimed at those with weaker ties. He watched Hroth listen and then rub a hand along his jaw where a thin scar caught light. He saw the leader undertake a private decision in public, whether to execute exile or bind the traders and march to the coast. When the votes were called, Hroth spoke. We will not spill blood without trial. We will take Olav and his ledger and lay them on the shore. We will call men who were approached and test names. If men confessed, we bind them. If they denied, we watch them. No summary death. Not for now. His tone carried the weight of a leader choosing restraint. A murmur. Brother Soren ground his teeth, but he did not overturn the call. The ritual expert felt a tiredness that came with the decision. He had wanted immediate closure. The room chose a slower justice. The emotional movement had taken them from suspicion to fear, to clarity, to compromise. They organized a small party to move against Olav. The ritual expert and Brother Keld led a group with the captive traders as bait. Elder Skald stayed to record names. Hroth went to the longhouse door and checked his blood-stained oath ring, turning it under the threshold light. At the shoreline they found a small quay and a boat moored with yellow rope, exactly as the fisherman had described. Olav's hut was empty save for a table and smoking pan. The ledger lay on the table. The ritual expert opened it and found names, sums, and Rendezvous notes. At the bottom someone had scrawled a list of longhouse names and marks. One name drew his eye. Brother Keld. He felt the world shift in a small, precise way. Another twist. The ledger suggested Brother Keld had been offered coin. Brother Keld's eyes narrowed, and he said nothing. The ritual expert looked up at him. Keld, Hroth, voice folded. You were at the shore. You led us to the fisherman. Did you? He could not finish without sounding like an accusation. Brother Keld's face tightened. He shrugged and then pushed a hand through his hair. I took coin once when my son was ill. I paid a healer. I thought no one would know. I burned the coin. I swore I would not do it again. I would never sell our ring. I would not. The hall later would test that statement, and the ledger would not prove Kelder's betrayal. But in that moment his confession shifted the group's dynamics. A man who admitted to a past moral failing gained a strange measure of credibility because he did not deny. The ritual expert registered a move, honesty as survival. They returned to the longhouse with Olav's ledger and a plan to call men named in its margins. Sun rose and washed the hall's rafters with flat light. Names were read aloud. Men stood one by one, listened, and either denied or wavered. Some were called and admitted they had taken coin. Others denied and then left in a raw hurry. The ritual expert questions and watched faces for micro-reactions. A thumb rubbing a scar, an eye flicked to a knot of men, a lip tensing. At length, after several confrontations and a near fistfight between Tor and a man named Rurik, they counted those who had admitted payment and those who had not. They bound the traders and prepared to escort Olaf's ledger to the sea court where neighboring leaders might weigh in. The Brotherhood's order had been tested. Some ties had frayed, but not all had snapped. When they came outside at first light, the ritual expert walked the marsh by the longhouse and found the single iron ring half buried in moss. He crouched and brushed away green, dirt crumbling under his fingers. He recognized the line where blood had dried into rust. He drew the ring free and held it in his palm. The ring fit his fingers like a sharp thought. He thought of the initiate who collapsed in the clearing, of the fisherman and the ledger, of Hroth's hand on the bench. Elder Skald approached and watched the ritual expert with the same slow measurement he used for recording history. "What will you do?" he asked. The ritual expert sealed the ring inside his field notebook without speaking. He shut the cover and pressed his thumb into the leather. He could have carried the ledger to an outside court and exposed names in public, tearing men from the Brotherhood and attracting coastal reprisal. He could also bury the ring, burn the ledger, and keep the secret small in order to preserve lives and avoid war. He had power to open wounds wider or to close them. He slid the notebook into the inside of his coat and buttoned it. The motion was physical, final. He had made his choice by action. He looked at Hroth, who leaned against the longhouse door and watched the low marsh light. "We bind those who confessed. Hroth, we watch the others. We mend what we can." The ritual expert nodded. He had been guided by suspicion at first, then by fear, then by methodical clarity, and finally by a pragmatic resignation that restraint now might preserve the Brotherhood's core. He thought of the men who had sold tokens for coin, some out of need, some for advantage, and did not romanticize their motives. He also thought of the men who had been tempted to name Tor, and of how quick scapegoating could be in a hall full of hungry pride. He walked away from the longhouse with the notebook pressed to his chest. He kept the ring hidden, not as cowardice but as choice. He would keep evidence and watch. He would not expose every wound to salt. He would let some things lie in order to prevent open slaughter. The group around him moved with a new, tight pattern. Men bound by oaths, men with stains on their hands, men who had to relearn trust. The final decision came with no speeches. The ritual expert closed his hand over the notebook and felt the iron ring's weight through the leather. He put the book in a satchel and began to walk toward the marsh path, leaving the longhouse behind him. Brother Keld joined him and walked beside him without speaking. Hroth watched them leave and then turned back to the hall and the men who would now rebuild the circle. When they reached the mossy ground outside the longhouse, the ritual expert stopped and dug a small depression with his boot. He placed the notebook into the satchel and pushed the satchel closed. He could have placed the ring on the stone for all to see. He did not. He put the satchel under his coat, then walked to a shallow pool of run-off water and dabbed his face with cold. He straightened. Elder Skald called the names of those bound and those watched. The men moved to their tasks, cleaning weapons, tending wounds, mending braids. Tor and Rurik clasped hands briefly outside the hall in a gesture that felt like an apology and a promise. Brother Soren sat on a bench and cleaned his blade, silence between polished steel and thought. Hroth tucked his oath ring back under his tunic and tested its weight. The ritual expert found Brother Keld by the shore at mid-morning, looking at the tide. "Why did you come to me with the fisherman?" he asked. His voice was straightforward. Keld answered in short phrases, "Because I want the Brotherhood to survive. Because I knew what coin could do. Because my son is alive." The ritual expert did not argue. He only said, "Then do not test us again." Keld's nod was the length of a promise. They walked back to the longhouse in a line that felt like the slow rethreading of a torn garment. Men who admitted to taking coin received binding tasks and public penance. Men who had been suspected but cleared returned to their places, faces set with the work of earning trust he knew. The ritual expert wrote a careful entry in his field notebook. Names, ledger extracts, the fisherman's statement, and the way the berserker had come close to murder at the barrow. He listed decisions made. The traders bound, Olaf's ledger taken to elders at the coast. Men watched rather than executed. He closed the entry and slid the notebook into his coat. The iron ring pressed against the leather like a small, cold secret. He had chosen to keep it sealed. He had chosen to let some wounds scab rather than rip them open to the salt of public shame. That choice would be judged later by law, by neighbors, and by the Brotherhood's own sense of honor. He walked outside again and saw Jarl Hroth step from the longhouse with his blood-stained oath ring visible at his throat. Hroth lifted a hand to the sky, then let it fall. He met the ritual expert's gaze briefly and said, "We will rebuild the circle. It will be harder. We will remember names. We will bind again and tighter." The ritual expert nodded once and looked at the marsh. He thought of the fisherman who had hauled the sodden ring from the kelp, and the initiate who had collapsed in the clearing. He thought of a ledger with names and of how fragile loyalty could be if coin entered the scale. He also thought of restraint as a practical instrument of survival. At first light, the ritual expert had found a half-buried iron ring, pulled it free, and sealed it inside his field notebook. He walked away without announcing the finding. The action closed the chapter. Evidence gathered, choices made, men judged by a mixture of confession and censure. The group left to repair what remained. He had acted in the world and left the consequences to be tested by time and watchful eyes. The ring lay hidden in leather, and the Brotherhood would decide what truth would be told and what quiet mercy would be kept.